Section 2.3 is talking about deductive reasoning. At the beginning of the year, we talked about inductive versus deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is using a series of facts to come to a conclusion. That differs from inductive reasoning in the sense that inductive reasoning is coming to a conclusion based on a pattern that you see. One way that I like to differentiate inductive reasoning from deductive reasoning is talking about families having children. Okay, for example, let's say a family has 7 children and they are having an 8th child. The first 7 were all girls. If I used inductive reasoning, in other words, I looked for a pattern, if the first 7 children were all girls, inductive reasoning would tell me that the next child would have to be a girl. That's inductive reasoning. You saw a pattern that they were all girls, so you would assume that the next one is a girl. Deductive reasoning is using a series of facts. So the facts for having a child are, if it's just one child, you got a 50-50 shot. It's either going to be a girl or a boy, you got a 50% chance. Deductive reasoning would say that you have a 50% chance of having a girl and 50% chance of having a boy. That's deductive reasoning, using only facts to come to a conclusion. Inductive reasoning, using a pattern that you see. Both have their place. These next few sections we're going to concentrate on deductive reasoning, so we're strictly going to be looking at facts. All right, so we're going to learn 2 specific laws that go with deductive reasoning. The first one is called the law of detachment. It says that if a conditional is true and the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion that follows would have to be true. Okay, an example of that says, here's my conditional statement. If it's sunny, then I go for a bike ride. That's a true statement. If it's sunny out, I usually bike. Okay, so then it says today it is sunny. So my hypothesis I know is true because today is sunny. So then what can I conclude? That I'm going to go for a bike ride. Yep. Okay. That's how the law of detachment works. If you're given a conditional and the first part is true, then the second part will have to be true. That's what the law of detachment says. The second law that we're going to look at is called the law of syllogism. The law of syllogism says if you have 2 conditional statements that are related, okay, I wrote it in symbol form, if P then R, and if R then Q. Notice that both of these are R's, which means that the conclusion from the first sentence has to be the hypothesis in the next sentence. And if that's true, and if both of those are true, then you can kind of skip over them and go right from the first to the last. Okay, so that's what the law of syllogism says. An example of that says, if today is Wednesday, then I have a morning meeting. Okay, that's a true statement. The next statement says, if I have a morning meeting, then I get up early. Notice, morning meeting, morning meeting. So what can I conclude? The law of syllogism says you can, since they match, you can cross them out and go right from the first if to the last then. So my conclusion would be, if today is Wednesday, then I get up early. Okay? All right. So let's look at some example problems of how we're going to be using these laws. All right, a gardener knows that if it rains, then the garden will be watered. Okay, true statement. It's raining. Okay, so what conclusion can he make? That the garden will be watered. And which one of the laws did he use? He used the law of detachment because there was a true statement and the hypothesis of that statement was true, therefore the conclusion would have to be true. Okay. Second example, if you make a field goal in basketball, that's a regular, from the field shot, you score 2 points. Well, Jenna scored 2 points. Can you conclude that she scored a field goal? Okay, well, let's look at this. If you make a field goal in basketball, then you score 2 points. Okay? It's a statement and it's true. And it says Jenna scored 2 points. Yes, okay, that's true. Can you conclude that Jenna scored a field goal? Now be careful, because the law of detachment says if the conditional is true and the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion is true. Which part is Jenna scored 2 points? Is it the hypothesis of the statement or the conclusion of the statement? It's the conclusion. So can you conclude that Jenna scored a field goal? The answer would be no. She could have scored the 2 points by doing 2 free throws. Okay, that would be a counterexample. So you have to be careful and make sure that it's the hypothesis that's true, then the conclusion follows. If it would have said Jenna made a field goal, then we could have concluded that she scored 2 points. We'll use some of them together. We'll use some of them separately and some of them together. Okay, so let's see here. It says you can use the laws to help you come to some conclusions. All right, here's what we've got. If it rains, then Jane stays inside. If she stays inside, then she will get her homework done. Okay, now the first thing that you should notice here is that the conclusion of this statement matches the hypothesis of the next one. So what conclusion can you come to? Well, our law of syllogism says you can cross those out if they match and go right from if it rains to then Jane gets her homework done. So that would be the conclusion that we come to. If it rains, then Jane gets her homework done. That's an interesting way to spell gets. Gets her homework done. Okay. Which law did we use? We used the law of syllogism because that's the one that allows us to cross out things that match. All right. Let's say this says to take the following and make it a conditional and then write a conclusion based on the facts. Okay, so use our deductive reasoning. This says 2 angles whose measures add up to 180 are supplementary. Okay, so the first thing it says to do is change it into a conditional. So if, then, our subject is 2 angles. Let's see here, and then what are our 2 pieces? If 2 angles measures add up to 180, then they're supplementary. So we're going to say if 2 angles add up to 180, then they are supplementary. Is that a true statement? Yes, it is. If 2 angles add up to 180, then we would call them supplementary angles. And then we know that angle A is 150 and angle B is 30. Okay? Well, the question is, given this conditional statement, is the hypothesis true? Do the 2 angles add up to 180? Yup, 150 plus 30 is 180. So therefore, they are supplementary. So our conclusion would be that angle A and angle B are supplementary. And we use the law of detachment to say that because we made a true conditional statement and the hypothesis was true. Therefore, the conclusion would have to follow. All right, now here's your challenge problem for the day. Here's the information we have. If you live in Lubbock, then you live in Texas. Okay? If you live in Texas, then you live in the 28th state to enter the Union. Okay? What do you notice there first? That you've got 2 living in Texas. Okay? So the law of syllogism says that we can skip right over that and says if you live in Lubbock, then you live in the 28th state to enter the Union. The last part says Levin lives in Lubbock. If Levin lives in Lubbock, we have a conditional statement and we know the hypothesis is true. And the law of detachment says that if you have a true conditional and the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion will follow. So what can we ultimately conclude? That Levin lives in the 28th state to enter the Union. In this case, we actually used both the laws. We used the law of syllogism to cross out the matching pieces and get a more concise conditional. And then we used the law of detachment to say that since the hypothesis of our conditional was true, the conclusion would have to follow. That concludes this lesson, and here are your homework assignments.